At the family dinner, I saw my husband put something into my food. My heart dropped, but I stayed quiet. When they got distracted, I switched the bowls with my mother-in-law. Exactly 5 minutes later, she collapsed, foaming at the mouth. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart someone who thought you were weak. My name is Courtney, and I am 34 years old. For the past 5 years, I have been married to David, who is 52 and comes from a long line of generational wealth. I work as a senior forensic auditor in Chicago, uncovering white-collar crime and tracking hidden assets for corporate investigations. My career is built on noticing the small details that other people miss. It is a job that requires a cold and analytical mind. That exact mindset is what saved my life last night. We were seated in this private dining room of an exclusive country club. The occasion was the rehearsal dinner for my 23-year-old stepdaughter, Brittany. Brittany was marrying Spencer, who came from a prominent banking family. The merger of our families was the social event of the season. Despite my efforts planning the wedding, Brittany treated me with the same cold indifference that her grandmother Barbara did. They viewed me as an interloper who snagged David when his first wife passed away. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the long mahogany table where the wealthiest members of our social circle had gathered. I wore a tailored emerald gown that Barbara, my 72-year-old mother-in-law, had loudly criticized the moment I arrived. She told me it looked like something bought off a discount rack. Barbara spent my entire marriage reminding me that I did not belong in their world. She regularly referred to me as a middle-class calculator who only cared about spreadsheets. I ignored her insults because reacting was exactly what she wanted. Waiters placed steaming bowls of bisque before each guest. Reaching for my water glass, I caught movement in the polished silver tray resting directly behind my husband. The curved metal acted like a mirror reflecting the hands of David. In that distorted reflection, I watched him reach into his tuxedo jacket. He checked to see if anyone was looking, but failed to notice the tray. He then pulled out a small glass vial. He effortlessly popped the top and dumped a fine white powder directly into my bisque. He quickly stirred it with my spoon before hiding the vial. My blood ran cold. The man I had shared a bed with for half a decade was poisoning me in a room full of our relatives and friends. My heart hammered hard against my ribs. My first instinct was to stand up and scream for help. I wanted to push the dining table over and run out the heavy oak doors. But my professional training took over. In my line of work, panic is the ultimate enemy of survival. I deal with dangerous corporate criminals every day. I knew that if I made a scene, David would simply play the concerned husband. He had been telling our friends and my colleagues that my stressful auditing job was making me paranoid and mentally unstable. If I accused him of poisoning my soup without concrete proof, they would call a psychiatric transport immediately. They would lock me away and David would win. I needed to handle this situation with absolute precision. I took a deep breath, forcing my heart rate to slow down. I smoothed my linen napkin over my lap and waited for an opportunity. David provided the opportunity instantly. The sommelier approached to pour the wine. David took one sip and his face contorted in exaggerated fury. He slammed his glass down so hard the delicate crystal stem nearly snapped. He turned toward the young waiter and began to aggressively berate him. He raised his voice, demanding to know why they were serving a subpar vintage. It was a classic display of old money entitlement, designed to humiliate the staff and assert his dominance. Everyone at our table turned to watch the uncomfortable spectacle. Barbara leaned over to scoff at the poor waiter. That was my only window. I had perhaps 3 seconds of total distraction, while all eyes were fixed on David and the trembling sommelier standing beside him. Without making a single sound, I reached across the small physical gap between my specific place setting and Barbara's. I smoothly slid my poisoned bowl of lobster bisque over to her spot and pulled her untouched bowl directly in front of me. The two white porcelain dishes were completely identical to each other. I adjusted the placement meticulously so they rested perfectly in the center of the gold charger plates. When David finally finished dressing down the waiter and turned back to the table, everything looked exactly as it had just moments before. I quietly picked up my heavy silver spoon and took a slow, deliberate sip of the rich soup, looking right into David's eyes. David watched me intensely. He did not touch his own food. He just stared at me, waiting for a reaction. I kept my face entirely neutral, offering him a pleasant smile as I swallowed another spoonful. Barbara, meanwhile, was complaining about the draft in the room as she eagerly consumed her soup. She ate with the vigorous appetite of a woman who never worried about consequences. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. David began to frown slightly. He shifted in his seat, his eyes darting from my face to my half-empty bowl. He was clearly confused as to why I was still sitting upright and conversing normally with the guests across from me. Exactly 5 minutes after the swap, the hidden poison took effect. Barbara suddenly stopped talking mid-sentence. She let out a sharp, strangled gasp that silenced the conversations around her. Her hands flew to her throat. She tried to stand up, but her legs gave out instantly. Her arms flailed wildly outward, completely knocking over a massive crystal centerpiece. The heavy vase crashed onto the mahogany table, sending water and white roses spilling everywhere. Barbara collapsed forward, face-planting directly into her porcelain plate. A sickening, gurgling sound echoed loudly through the completely silent room. When her head rolled to the side, thick white foam was bubbling from her lips. Her eyes rolled back into her head as her body began to convulse against the table. Pure chaos erupted. Guests jumped out of their chairs, screaming in horror. Wine glasses shattered on the hardwood floor as people scrambled backward away from the seizing woman. Waiters rushed forward with napkins, and someone yelled to call an ambulance. In the midst of the absolute pandemonium, I looked at David. He did not rush to comfort his dying mother. He did not yell for a doctor. He whipped his head toward me. His eyes were wide with a terrifying realization of exactly what had transpired. His face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He pointed his finger directly at my chest and yelled over the screaming crowd, "My wife! Look at her! My wife did this to us! Her paranoia has finally made her snap. She just poisoned my mother." The wail of sirens shattered the evening air from the country club to the hospital. Harsh, fluorescent lights of the emergency room washed over pristine white walls. Paramedics rushed through double doors, pushing the rattling stretcher that held Barbara. A plastic oxygen mask covered her face, and clear tubes trailed from her arms. David sprinted alongside the moving gurney, clutching his chest, playing the part of the terrified son to absolute perfection. I followed behind, escorted by 2 uniformed police officers who had been dispatched to the restaurant after his wild public accusation. They had not arrested me yet, but they made it perfectly clear I was not allowed out of their direct sight. Spencer arrived minutes later, accompanied by his wealthy parents. The banking magnates looked completely out of place, standing inside the chaotic waiting room, wearing tailored evening wear, and bearing expressions of profound distaste. David saw them enter and abandoned his watchful position by the busy triage desk. He stumbled forward towards Spencer, staggering dramatically before collapsing heavily into the arms of the younger man. He buried his tearful face deep in his shaking hands, allowing his broad shoulders to heave with loud, fabricated sobs. The entire performance was masterfully executed. He flawlessly portrayed himself as an innocent man completely broken by sudden tragedy. David pulled back and pointed a trembling finger directly at me. He looked at Spencer and his wealthy parents with tears streaming down his face. "She did this," he cried out, his voice echoing through the busy corridor. Her jealousy and her unstable mental health finally caused her to completely snap. She has been unraveling for months. She resented my mother. She resented the wedding. She wanted to destroy everything we have built because she could never truly fit in. The mother of Spencer gasped, pulling her mink shawl tighter around her shoulders as she glared at me with undisguised horror. The officers beside me shifted uncomfortably, clearly swayed by the raw emotion radiating from the grieving son. I stood entirely still, keeping my face completely blank. A forensic auditor learns very early on that any display of emotion can and will be used against you during an investigation. If I cried, they would call it guilt. If I yelled, they would call it hysteria. I simply observed, absorbing every detail of his performance. David wiped his eyes and turned his attention to the attending physician, a tired-looking man holding a digital tablet. David stepped into the personal space of the doctor, using his height and expensive tuxedo to project an aura of undeniable authority. "I need you to place my wife on an involuntary psychiatric hold immediately," he demanded, his tone shifting from sorrowful to commanding. "She is an absolute danger to herself and to everyone in this building. She deliberately poisoned my mother in a crowded dining room. There is no telling what she might do next." The doctor hesitated, glancing over at me. "Sir, we need to wait for the laboratory results before we can make any definitive determinations about poisoning. Until then, this is a police matter." David aggressively shook his head, leaning closer to the doctor. "You do not understand what I have been dealing with behind closed doors," he said, lowering his voice just enough to sound intimate, but keeping it loud enough for the nurses and the police officers to hear. "I tried to save her from her trailer park roots, but the pressure of our lifestyle broke her mind. She came from nothing. She had nothing. I gave her a beautiful life, and she repaid me with violent paranoid delusions. She needs to be heavily sedated and confined before she hurts someone else." I felt a cold chill wash over me as the puzzle pieces slammed into place. This had been his backup plan all along. He had been planting these toxic seeds for years. He had been carefully crafting a public narrative that I was a fragile lower-class woman who was cracking under the immense pressure of high society. He gaslighted me in private and assassinated my character in public. Now he was using that exact narrative to legally silence me. The attending physician looked at the tear-stained face of my husband and then looked at my silent, rigid posture. The doctor clearly did not want to cross a powerful billionaire who was currently experiencing a family tragedy. The hospital relied heavily on donations from men exactly like David. The doctor gave a slow, reluctant nod and tapped a few commands into his tablet. "I will order a 72-hour psychiatric observation." "Hold," the doctor said quietly. "We will administer a strong sedative to keep her calm during the initial evaluation period. It is for her own safety as well as ours." I opened my mouth to calmly object, to explain that I was of completely sound mind and that they were violating my rights. But before I could utter a single word, two heavy-set orderlies stepped out from a nearby set of swinging doors. They were broad-shouldered men wearing thick blue scrubs and carrying themselves with the heavy, confident steps of people accustomed to restraining violent patients. One of them held a medical tray. Resting on top of that tray was a large plastic syringe filled with a clear liquid. They approached me with practiced precision, flanking me on both sides. The two police officers took a step back, effectively handing over jurisdiction to the hospital staff. The orderlies did not look at me like a human being. They looked at me like a volatile problem that needed to be chemically erased. "Madame, I am definitely going to need you to come with us quietly," the taller orderly said, extending a large hand toward my arm. "We do not want to use force, but we will if you make this difficult. Just relax and let the medication do its work." I took a slow step backward until my shoulder blades hit the cold, solid surface of the sterile hospital wall. I was entirely trapped. To my left stood the orderlies holding a sedative that would knock me unconscious for 3 days. To my right stood the police officers who fully believed I was a deranged poisoner. Directly in front of me stood David, standing shoulder to shoulder with the wealthy parents of the groom. David watched me with a dark, triumphant gleam in his eyes. He thought he had won. He truly believed his wealth and his lies had built an inescapable cage around me. I let my shoulders slump forward slightly, mimicking the posture of a woman who had finally accepted her tragic defeat. I let out a long, trembling breath and slowly raised my empty left hand in a gesture of complete surrender. The orderlies visibly relaxed their defensive stances, believing I was submitting to their authority. But as I held my left hand at shoulder height, my right hand slipped downward, brushing against the smooth fabric of my tailored emerald gown. I slid my trembling fingers deep into the concealed pocket of my blazer. The cool, heavy metal resting inside grounded me instantly. During the sheer, unmitigated chaos at the restaurant when wine glasses were shattering and guests were screaming over Barbara collapsing, I did not just seamlessly swap our porcelain soup bowls to save my own life. I did something much more dangerous. When David had frantically jumped back from the dining table in his initial panic, he had dropped something highly secretive onto the thick Persian rug. My fingers curled tightly around the sleek rectangular object hidden safely deep within my pocket. I gripped his highly encrypted burner phone very tightly. I did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. As the taller orderly reached out to grab my arm, I suddenly dropped to a crouch and ducked straight under his heavy grasp. He stumbled forward, thrown off balance by his own momentum. I spun around and bolted down the pristine hospital corridor. Behind me, I heard the immediate eruption of shouts. David was screaming for them to catch me. The heavy footsteps of the orderlies pounded against the linoleum floor. I ignored the burning in my lungs and the frantic hammering of my heart. I sprinted past a row of startled nurses and a family huddled in a waiting area. My emerald evening gown was heavy and restrictive, but I pulled the fabric up above my knees and kept running. I knew this hospital layout perfectly because my own firm had audited their billing department 2 years ago. I rounded a sharp corner and aimed directly for the staff-only restricted access wing. At the very end of the hall, there was a heavy gray door marked for laundry chute access and maintenance staff. I shoved my shoulder hard against the metal frame and slipped inside just as the orderlies rounded the corner behind me. The door slammed shut with a solid, definitive thud, cutting off the chaotic sounds of the emergency room. I threw the heavy deadbolt latch, locking myself safely inside the cramped utility space. The air in here smelled strongly of industrial bleach and damp concrete. My chest heaved as I leaned against the cold metal door, listening to the muffled thumping of boots running past my hiding spot in the hallway outside. They had completely missed my exit. I did not linger to celebrate my temporary victory. I pushed through the second set of doors leading to the emergency maintenance stairwell. The lighting in the stairwell was incredibly dim, with only a few flickering fluorescent bulbs casting long, eerie shadows against the concrete walls. I descended 2 flights of stairs, moving as quietly as possible until I reached a dark landing. I sat down heavily on the cold concrete steps, pulling the fabric of my gown tightly around my legs. The silence down here was absolute and suffocating. It was just me and the sleek black phone I had stolen from the man who tried to murder me. I pulled the burner phone from my pocket. It was a high-end model encased in a matte black cover. The screen was completely blank, giving nothing away. When I tapped the power button, a biometric lock screen appeared demanding a thumbprint or a complex alphanumeric passcode. David was meticulous about his digital security, but he always underestimated my technical capabilities. I rolled up my left sleeve to expose my smartwatch. It was not a standard consumer device, but a specialized piece of hardware issued by my forensic auditing firm. It contained military-grade decryption software designed specifically to bypass restricted digital ledgers during hostile corporate takeovers. I pulled a short tether cable from my small evening clutch and physically connected the burner phone directly to my smartwatch. The tiny screen on my wrist flared to life, glowing with rapid lines of green code. I initiated the bypass sequence and held my breath. The software immediately went to work brute-forcing the biometric encryption. The digital progress bar crawled forward at an agonizingly slow pace. 1%, 5%, 10%. The dim stairwell felt like a tomb. I stared at the tiny screen, willing it to move faster. Every single second that passed felt like an eternity. If the security team decided to sweep the maintenance stairwells, they would find me sitting here trapped like a rat. 15 minutes went by before the progress bar finally hit 100%. A soft chime echoed in the silent stairwell. The screen of the burner phone flashed bright white and then unlocked. I was in. My fingers flew across the glass screen, moving with the practiced efficiency of a seasoned investigator. I bypassed the superficial applications and dug straight into the encrypted files hidden deep within the operating system. What I found there made the blood freeze in my veins. I opened a folder containing ledgers for David and his sprawling real estate empire. For years, David had projected the image of a titan of industry, a man whose generational wealth was untouchable. The ledgers told a completely different story. Every single one of his luxury properties was leveraged to the absolute maximum. His commercial developments were hemorrhaging cash. The holding companies were drowning in high-interest debt from private lenders. David Blackwell was entirely and completely bankrupt. His vast empire was nothing but an elaborate house of cards waiting for a stiff breeze to knock it down. But the bankruptcy was not the most horrifying discovery. I opened the encrypted messaging application and found hundreds of emails between David and his mother, Barbara. I scrolled through the exchanges, my stomach twisting into tight, painful knots. They were not just broke. They were actively stealing from their own flesh and blood. When David lost his first wife, he became the co-trustee of a massive $10 million trust fund set up for his daughter Brittany. The money was legally locked away until she turned 25 or got married. The bank records attached to the emails showed a series of complex wire transfers. Over the past 3 years, David and Barbara had been illegally siphoning massive amounts of money out of Brittany and her trust fund. They used shadow accounts and dummy corporations to funnel her inheritance directly into their failing businesses. They had drained nearly $8 million from the young woman. There was barely anything left in the account. I kept digging, clicking into a separate folder labeled with the name Spencer. Spencer was the elite banking heir who was supposed to marry Brittany tomorrow afternoon. I opened the correspondence between David and the father of Spencer. The wedding was an absolute sham. It was a carefully orchestrated business transaction disguised as a romance. The banking family knew that David was financially struggling, but they wanted the social prestige of merging with the Blackwell name. They were offering David a massive financial bailout, structured as a corporate partnership immediately following the nuptials. Brittany was nothing more than a pawn being traded away to save the failing reputation of her father. The sheer scale of the betrayal was staggering. David was selling his own daughter to a family of elitist snobs just to keep himself out of federal prison. I sat on the concrete stairs, staring at the illuminated screen as the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. I suddenly understood exactly why David had poured that white powder into my lobster bisque. As the legally appointed co-trustee of the estate belonging to Brittany, I was required by law to conduct a comprehensive mandatory audit of all her financial assets. That audit was officially scheduled to take place on the Monday morning immediately following the wedding weekend. If I sat down on Monday and opened those accounts, I would instantly discover the theft. A psychiatric hold would give David sole emergency control to forge the paperwork and steal everything. Suddenly, the heavy metal door above me violently clicked open. Footsteps echoed down the stairs. I froze in the dark, gripping the phone tightly to my chest as the heavy boots approached me. I pressed my spine flat against the freezing concrete wall directly beneath the metal landing. The heavy boots thumped louder above me, their impact vibrating through the steel floorboards. A bright beam of tactical white light swept across the painted cinder blocks. I held my breath, clamping my free hand tightly over my mouth to completely silence any terrified gasp. The hospital security guard paused his patrol right above my hiding spot. The intense beam of his flashlight pierced the heavy darkness, slicing violently through the thick dust motes that danced in the stagnant stairwell air. The blinding light swept down the concrete stairs, brightly illuminating the delicate emerald fabric at the very tips of my evening gown. I frantically pulled the silk material tighter around my bare legs, making myself as physically small as humanly possible in the narrow shadows. The stark circle of light hovered mere inches from my pale face. I could clearly see the black scuff marks on the reinforced toe of his combat boots. I squeezed my eyes shut, mentally preparing myself for the inevitable angry shout. I braced for the rough hands of the orderlies violently grabbing my arms. I anticipated the sharp chemical restraint of the liquid sedative plunging deep into my neck. But the terrifying light wavered slightly, and then slowly shifted away from my position. The guard mumbled a garbled string of numbers into a two-way radio. He turned on his heel and continued his steady march down the next flight of stairs. The heavy door at the bottom of the stairwell banged shut with a resounding echo. It left me completely alone in the silent shadows once more. I finally exhaled a shaky breath, feeling my lungs burning fiercely from the extreme oxygen deprivation. With the physical threat gone, I refocused my attention on the screen of the phone resting in my lap. The financial ruin of David Blackwell was a massive revelation, but I needed to understand the mechanics of this wedding. I navigated away from the ledgers and opened his email application. I bypassed the inbox and went directly into an archive folder labeled with Spencer's initials. My eyes scanned the correspondence, absorbing the cruelty of the men involved. Spencer was not a groom marrying into a prominent family. He knew everything about the financial situation. He knew that David was insolvent. He knew the Blackwell real estate empire was nothing more than a sinking ship. Spencer was using that exact leverage to execute a corporate extortion scheme. I read an email sent by Spencer 2 weeks ago. He demanded a massive 30% cut of Brittany's remaining trust fund. He explicitly called this transfer a dowry. He stated that transferring those liquid assets into his accounts was the only way he would proceed with the marriage. He promised to agree to merge his family's banking firm with David's failing companies only if the money cleared. David had agreed to these terms. They negotiated the purchase price of a human being over coffee. Brittany was nothing more than a convenient pawn to these men. She thought she was marrying the man of her dreams. She thought her loving father was walking her down the aisle toward a beautiful future. Instead, her own father was selling her to the highest bidder to save his own skin, and the groom was happy to steal her inheritance as a signing bonus. The reality of their arrangement made my blood boil. The entire wedding ceremony scheduled for tomorrow afternoon was an elaborate illusion designed to facilitate a massive theft from a young woman. I had to stop them. I had to protect Brittany at all costs. Even though she had consistently treated me with the exact same cold disdain as the rest of her elite family, she absolutely did not deserve to be sold out by her own father. She was a tragic victim of his lifelong psychological manipulation, completely blind to the greedy monsters standing right beside her. I desperately needed to show her the absolute truth before she walked down that church aisle and legally bound her entire life to Spencer. Using the specialized forensic auditing software downloaded on my smartwatch, I began extracting the sensitive data directly from the burner phone. I carefully compiled the hidden offshore bank statements, the fake corporate ledgers, and the damning email exchanges between David and Spencer. I formatted everything seamlessly into an undeniable and ironclad digital dossier. It was a complete financial autopsy of David Blackwell, meticulously organized with the exact precision of a federal criminal indictment. I just needed to send this highly secure file directly to Brittany. I opened the encrypted messaging application on my smartwatch, preparing to text her the secure access link. Then I suddenly stopped, remembering a seemingly innocuous conversation from much earlier in the evening. While we were getting dressed for the upscale rehearsal dinner, David had confidently walked into Brittany's luxurious bridal suite. He played the role of the doting and protective father flawlessly. He gently told her that she looked incredibly stressed out and needed to focus entirely on her happiness and inner peace. He then smoothly confiscated her personal smartphone, claiming he was initiating a mandatory wedding eve relaxation protocol. He promised her he would personally handle all incoming calls and text messages so she could just be present in the joyful moment. It was absolutely not a gesture of genuine fatherly care. It was a highly calculated tactical maneuver designed to completely isolate her from the world. David had intentionally cut off her only direct line of communication with anyone outside his immediate control. I could not simply text her the digital dossier because David was the specific person currently holding her phone. Sending the encrypted files now would only immediately alert him that I had successfully cracked his digital security and possessed his most damning secrets. I had to figure out how to deliver the evidence to her. I needed to escape this hospital, find a highly secure location to print the documents, and secretly infiltrate the guarded wedding venue tomorrow morning before the ceremony began. I stood up from the cold concrete stairs, feeling my leg muscles stiff and aching from the physical tension. I slipped the burner phone back into the concealed pocket of my gown and smoothed down the emerald fabric to hide it. I crept down the remaining flight of stairs, moving silently toward the metal exit door that led out into the hospital parking garage. I pressed my ear against the freezing cold steel, listening for any sign of movement on the other side. Hearing nothing but the distant muffled hum of city traffic, I slowly depressed the heavy metal crash bar. The latch clicked open with a loud clack that echoed up and down the narrow stairwell. I pushed the heavy steel door outward, stepping over the concrete threshold into the dimly lit gray expanse of the parking structure. The harsh yellow lights of the parking garage flickered above, casting long, strange shadows across the oil-stained concrete floor. The cool, damp night air hit my face, offering a very brief, fleeting moment of physical relief from the oppressive heat of the cramped hospital. But that comforting relief evaporated instantly into pure dread. As the heavy metal door swung completely shut behind me with a solid thud, I found myself standing completely still, locked face to face with someone waiting silently on the exact other side. Stepping out of the harsh shadows cast by a flickering overhead fluorescent light was Felicia. David's younger sister stood blocking my path, wrapped in a tailored camel hair trench coat that cost more than my first car. Her blonde hair was pulled back into an immaculate chignon, highlighting the sharp aristocratic angles of a face that usually looked down on anyone outside her tax bracket. Beside her stood a man who looked like he had been carved directly out of solid gray granite. He wore a crisp, dark suit and a matching driving cap, but his thick neck and heavily calloused hands clearly suggested his primary job description involved physical intimidation rather than navigating luxury sedans through city traffic. They had obviously been waiting for me to exit this exact maintenance stairwell. Felicia did not look surprised to see me standing there clutching the black device. She just looked profoundly annoyed that I was taking up her valuable time. She extended her hand, palm facing upward in a silent, demanding gesture. The cold, damp air of the concrete parking structure swirled around us, carrying the faint metallic scent of car exhaust and standing water. I gripped the burner phone tighter against my chest, refusing to break eye contact with her. The massive chauffeur took a slow, deliberate step forward, his heavy shoes crunching against the loose gravel scattered across the floor. He crossed his thick arms over his broad chest, waiting for a command from his employer. Felicia let out a sharp, exasperated sigh. Her meticulously manicured fingers twitched. She told me to hand over the phone right now, and perhaps they would let me leave the hospital with a shred of my dignity intact. I took a very slow step backward, bumping my shoulder blades against the heavy steel door I had just pushed open. The realization of her presence here completely shattered any remaining illusions I held about the Blackwell family dynamics. David had not been acting alone. He did not orchestrate this massive financial fraud in a vacuum. He had active, willing accomplices. Before I could formulate a verbal response, Felicia lunged forward. She moved with a sudden vicious speed that completely belied her elegant country club appearance. Her hands shot out, grabbing roughly at my forearms. Her sharp acrylic nails dug painfully deep through the fabric of my suit jacket, scratching fiercely against my bare skin. I twisted my body sideways, trying to shield the device from her grasping fingers. The burner phone was the only piece of concrete evidence keeping me out of a locked psychiatric ward. I wrestled against her surprising strength, gritting my teeth as her nails broke the surface of my skin. "You gold-digging auditor!" She spat directly into my face. The scent of her expensive floral perfume was cloying and suffocating in the enclosed space. "You really think you can outsmart old money? We bury people like you before breakfast." She jerked my left arm hard, trying to throw me off balance. Her perfectly painted face contorted into a mask of ugly, unfiltered snobbery. "Did you honestly believe all those late nights you spent poring over corporate spreadsheets mattered to us? The entire family knew about the trust fund theft, Courtney. Every single one of us. My mother, my father, myself. We all actively participated in keeping you completely distracted while David drained Brittany dry. You were nothing but a convenient middle-class smokescreen meant to keep the federal regulators looking the other way. We laughed at you behind your back every time you boasted about your little forensic accounting achievements. Her cruel words slammed into my chest with the force of a physical blow. The lavish family dinners, the sudden weekend trips they insisted I take to relax, the endless pointless errands Barbara sent me on under the guise of family bonding. It was all a highly orchestrated campaign of misdirection. They had weaponized my desire to fit into their family against me. They gave me mundane tasks to keep me occupied, so I would never have the free time to actually look at the internal accounts of the estate. They treated me like a naive, uneducated outsider because it made it easier for them to rob a 23-year-old girl blind. Felicia yanked my arm again, tearing the delicate fabric of my sleeve. She ordered her driver to grab the phone. The giant man uncrossed his arms and took another heavy step toward me, reaching out with hands the size of dinner plates. My corporate training kicked in, pushing the sharp sting of emotional betrayal to the back of my mind. Last year, my auditing firm had mandated a rigorous self-defense and situational awareness seminar for all senior field agents due to the increasing risks of confronting hostile executives. I had practiced these exact defensive maneuvers for hours on foam dummies in a brightly lit gymnasium. Now I had to execute them on cold concrete against an enraged socialite and a trained enforcer. I stopped pulling away from Felicia and instead stepped aggressively into her personal space. This sudden change in momentum caught her completely off guard. She stumbled forward, losing her solid footing. As she did, I reached up with my free hand and firmly grabbed her right wrist. I clamped my fingers tightly over her delicate bones. In one fluid, highly practiced motion, I twisted her wrist sharply outward and downward. The joint locked, applying immediate agonizing pressure. Felicia let out a high-pitched shriek of genuine pain. Her grip on my jacket released instantly as her body naturally contorted to follow the twisting motion of her trapped arm. Using her own forward momentum against her, I shoved her violently backward. I pushed her directly into the path of the advancing chauffeur. The massive driver grunted in surprise as his wealthy employer crashed heavily into his broad chest. He instinctively threw his thick arms around her to prevent them both from tumbling backward onto the oil-stained pavement. They became a tangled mess of camel hair fabric and dark suit jackets stumbling clumsily over their own feet. I did not wait for them to recover their balance. I spun around and bolted across the dimly lit parking garage. I sprinted past the parked vehicles, listening to the frantic pounding of heavy boots behind me. The massive chauffeur had finally untangled himself and was furiously giving chase. His powerful strides were closing the distance with terrifying speed. Under a flickering yellow light, I finally spotted my dark gray sedan. I plunged my trembling hand into my clutch and retrieved my car keys. I reached the door as heavy footsteps rounded the concrete pillar right behind me. I threw myself into the driver's seat and slammed the car door shut. My thumb instantly smashed the central lock button on the door. A massive fist slammed violently against the driver's side window. He struck the thick glass again, screaming muffled curses. My hands were shaking as I jammed the key into the ignition. I slammed the gear shift into drive and stomped the gas pedal. I accelerated out of the space, leaving the enraged man in my rearview mirror. I blasted through the wooden exit gate, speeding into the dark city street. I was breathing heavily as I sped completely out of the hospital garage. The sudden vibration of the stolen burner phone broke the silence. A new terrifying message popped directly onto the illuminated screen. I stared down at the glowing rectangle resting on the passenger seat. The bright light cast a harsh glare against the dark interior of the car. My eyes locked onto the messaging application. It was a fresh alert from a contact saved only under a string of numbers. I picked up the device, keeping my other hand tightly gripped on the steering wheel. The message was brief, but it carried the weight of a death sentence. "We have eyes on Courtney and her car," the text read. "Do we intercept before the ceremony?" The sender was a member of the private off-the-books security team David employed for his acquisitions. They were mercenaries who specialized in making problems disappear for the ultra-wealthy. I barely had time to process the terror of that first message before a second text bubbled up onto the screen. This reply came directly from the cellular device belonging to David. "Make it look like a tragic accident," David wrote. "She does not make it to the church tomorrow. A cold wave of adrenaline crashed over me, washing away the pain of the scratches Felicia had left on my arms. I dropped the burner phone onto the passenger seat as if it had suddenly caught fire. My eyes darted frantically up to the rearview mirror. The dark streets were slick with rain, and the glow of street lamps smeared across the wet asphalt. Every single pair of headlights appearing behind me suddenly looked like a lethal threat. I pressed the accelerator harder, weaving around a slow-moving delivery truck. My heart hammered against my ribs with the force of a jackhammer. David was not just trying to silence me with a fraudulent hospital psychiatric hold anymore. I had humiliated his sister, assaulted his trusted chauffeur, and stolen the digital keys to his kingdom. He knew I possessed the proof of his financial crimes and his betrayal of his daughter. He was backed into a corner, and a desperate billionaire with everything to lose was the most dangerous kind of predator. I rapidly checked my mirrors again. A dark sport utility vehicle turned onto the avenue 3 blocks back. My breath hitched painfully in my throat. Was it them? Were they already tracking my movements through the downtown grid? I took a sharp right turn down a narrow alleyway, my tires screaming. I held my breath, waiting to see if the large vehicle would follow my path. It continued straight past the intersection, but the crushing grip of paranoia did not release its hold. I realized with sickening clarity that attending the wedding tomorrow as I had planned was an absolute impossibility. I had thought I could sneak into the resort venue, print the documents, and hand the evidence directly to Brittany before she walked down the aisle. But David had just turned that beautiful wedding into a literal death trap. His private security team would be stationed at every entrance, covering every hallway and watching every security camera. If I even approached the perimeter of that estate, they would quietly intercept me. They would run my sedan off a steep embankment or ensure my brakes failed on a sharp curve. They would make sure I became just another tragic morning headline. A grieving wife who was driving too fast and lost control of her vehicle. I drove aimlessly for another 20 minutes, trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and the hospital. But the crushing anxiety continued to build with every passing mile. I kept checking the rearview mirror, anticipating the sudden glare of high beams rushing up to ram my bumper. How did the security team already have eyes on my car? The question bounced around my skull until the horrifying answer finally materialized. The vehicle itself was the primary problem. This sedan was registered under the corporate holding company David managed. It was equipped with an integrated global positioning system that monitored location and mileage for tax purposes. I was driving a massive glowing beacon, broadcasting my exact geographic coordinates directly to his security team in real time. They did not need to physically follow me from the hospital parking garage, because they could pull up my location on a digital map whenever they wanted. I reached into my evening clutch and pulled out my own personal smartphone. The screen displayed 3 missed calls from David and a barrage of unread text messages demanding to know my location. My phone was on the same family data plan as his personal devices. He could easily ping the location of the device through the cellular provider using his administrative account privileges. I was carrying multiple active tracking devices straight into whatever trap he was setting for me. The realization forced me to make a brutal and immediate decision. I could not simply drive back to our shared home and quickly pack a bag. I could not go to the police station because David owned half the politicians and law enforcement commanders in the city. If I walked into a precinct clutching a stolen burner phone, his lawyers would have me committed to a locked psych ward before I could file a report. I needed a completely untraceable sanctuary to finish compiling the digital dossier and figure out a new way to reach Brittany. I navigated away from the busy downtown core, steering the car toward the desolate industrial outskirts of the city. The towering skyscrapers gradually gave way to empty warehouses and dark chain-link fences topped with sharp razor wire. The streetlights became scarce, casting long stretches of unbroken shadows across the crumbling roads. After miles of driving, I finally spotted the flickering neon sign of a rundown gas station. It sat completely alone on a deserted stretch of highway, surrounded by overgrown weeds and rusted cars. The glowing blue lights of the small convenience mart hummed loudly in the quiet, damp night air. There were absolutely no other vehicles parked anywhere near the illuminated fuel pumps. The lone attendant inside the glass booth was slumped over the counter, fast asleep. It was the absolute perfect desolate place to make myself permanently disappear. I pulled my sedan up to the furthest pump, parking it in the dark shadows away from the overhead canopy. I put the car in park, but deliberately left the engine idling smoothly. I unbuckled my seatbelt and reached for my personal smartphone. For a brief, agonizing moment, I looked at the dark screen, thinking about the contacts, the photos, and the entire life I was about to throw away. But my immediate physical survival required absolute, undeniable sacrifice. I tossed my personal phone onto the soft leather passenger seat right next to my designer wallet. I left my credit cards, my driver identification, and all the cash I had tucked inside. I could not risk using anything that directly tied back to my legal name. I grabbed the stolen burner phone and my specialized smartwatch, making sure the charging tether cable was secured in my hand. I opened the heavy driver's side door and stepped out into the freezing cold night air. I left the keys dangling loosely in the ignition and the car engine softly humming. Anyone actively tracking the vehicle coordinates would think I had stopped for gas. I closed the car door quietly and walked backward into the deep shadows of the surrounding trees. I had to become a complete, untraceable ghost in the wind. The damp earth soaked through my satin heels as I retreated further into the dense tree line. I crouched behind the trunk of an ancient oak, watching the glowing canopy of the gas station from the darkness. The temperature plummeted, and my bare arms broke out in shivers, but I stayed still. I needed to ensure the trap was set perfectly. As the first bruised light of dawn began to bleed across the eastern horizon, a rusty pickup truck rattled into the desolate station. A lanky teenager hopped out wearing an oversized hooded sweatshirt and torn jeans. He walked toward the convenience store, rubbing his tired eyes. I startled the boy as I approached him. I reached into the lining of my bra and pulled out $200 bills. It was a paranoid habit from my days of hostile field audits to always carry untraceable cash. I offered the money to him with a specific set of instructions. I told him to drive my idling sedan to the international airport. I instructed him to park it in the darkest corner of the long-term parking garage, leave the keys under the floor mat, and walk away. He looked at my ruined emerald gown, the fresh scratches on my arms, and the thick wad of cash in my hand. He snatched the bills, jumped into the driver's seat of my car, and sped off toward the interstate highway. David and his ruthless security team would track that global positioning signal straight to Terminal 3. They would waste the entire morning scouring flight manifests and departure gates, fully believing I had fled the state in absolute terror. But I had absolutely no intention of leaving the city. I flagged down a bakery truck making its morning delivery route and bartered my designer watch for a ride back to the downtown district. The historic hotel chosen for the wedding occupied an entire city block. It was an imposing fortress crawling with private security and valet attendants. The grand main entrances were heavily guarded. I circled around the back of the massive building, navigating down a narrow cobblestone alleyway that smelled of damp cardboard. The bustling loading docks were a chaotic hive of frantic activity. Delivery vans were lined up bumper to bumper, unloading towering stacks of white folding chairs, floral arrangements, and crates of expensive champagne. I crouched behind a stack of wooden pallets, waiting for my perfect opening. A catering assistant stepped out the back door carrying a heavy garment bag over her shoulder. She set it down on a metal cart to light a cigarette, turning her back to the busy dock. I moved silently, pulling the black uniform out of the unzipped bag and slipping it over my ruined evening gown. The oversized slacks and crisp white button-down shirt swallowed my frame, hiding the emerald silk and the scratches from Felicia. I grabbed a stray clipboard from a utility cart and walked right through the open double doors, projecting the aura of a stressed employee running late for her shift. The suffocating heat of the industrial kitchen washed over me instantly. The air was thick with the rich scent of roasting meats and spun sugar. Dozens of chefs and servers rushed past me, shouting frantic orders over the din of clattering silver pans. I kept my face angled downward, navigating the maze of bright fluorescent service corridors with calculated purpose. I narrowly avoided disaster when I rounded a corner and spotted the mother of the groom standing near the service elevators. She was loudly berating a terrified floral designer about the exact shade of the white hydrangeas. I ducked into a narrow linen closet, pressing myself tightly against the stacks of freshly laundered tablecloths until her sharp footsteps faded down the hall. I slipped back out of the closet and continued my search through the dark hotel's sub-basement. I needed access to their internal network. As a forensic auditor, I knew that large luxury hotels required dedicated server rooms to handle their vast security systems and guest data. I finally found a heavy reinforced steel door marked with a red Authorized Personnel Only sign. I pushed the door open and stepped into a climate-controlled room filled with towering racks of blinking computer servers. A young technician wearing thick headphones and a rumpled polo shirt looked up from his dual-monitor desk. He scrambled to take off his headphones, staring at my catering uniform with utter confusion. He opened his mouth to demand what I was doing in a restricted network zone, but I did not give him the chance to speak. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the solid brass badge issued by my corporate auditing firm. I flashed it quickly, allowing the crest to catch the harsh overhead lighting. I adopted a tone of complete professional irritation. I told him I was a senior agent with the Corporate Compliance Division, conducting an emergency unannounced spot check on network security protocols for the high-profile wedding party upstairs. I stated that the wealthy clients had reported a potential breach in their digital privacy, and I was here to secure the primary server firewall. The young technician blinked rapidly, completely overwhelmed by my aggressive barrage of corporate jargon. I barked an order telling him to go to the main lobby immediately and report to the security director for a physical perimeter sweep while I locked down the internal system. The terrified young man nodded furiously, grabbed his half-empty coffee cup, and practically sprinted out of the server room. The moment the heavy steel door clicked shut behind him, I engaged the internal deadbolt and shoved a rolling chair underneath the door handle for extra measure. I was completely locked inside the digital nerve center of the entire building. I dropped the stolen burner phone onto the desk and plugged it into the network interface using the cable from my smartwatch. I bypassed the firewalls with the decryption software on my wrist. Within minutes, I tapped directly into the closed-circuit camera feeds for the entire property. A massive grid of live video squares populated the dual monitors in front of me. I scanned the overwhelming wall of footage, watching oblivious guests mingling in the lobby and catering staff setting up the ballroom. I quickly isolated the feed for the penthouse level and expanded the camera, viewing the luxurious corridor outside the bridal suite. I needed to know exactly where Brittany was and who was guarding her. I clicked into the camera feed positioned inside the bridal parlor. The high-definition color video filled my screen. Brittany was sitting on the edge of a plush velvet sofa wearing a white silk robe. Her face was pale and drawn, reflecting none of the joy a bride should feel on her wedding day. The heavy mahogany doors swung open and David walked into the frame. He was dressed in his tuxedo, but his posture was slumped and defeated. He was clutching a stack of legal documents in his right hand. I leaned closer to the monitor, watching as he sat down beside his daughter. He reached out and took her hands, bowing his head. His shoulders began to heave with heavy sobs. He was crying fake tears to the daughter he was actively selling into financial ruin. He raised his head and wiped his eyes, presenting the stack of legal documents to her with a trembling hand. I leaned closer to the glowing monitor until my nose was mere inches from the scratched glass of the screen. The security feed was entirely silent, leaving me to rely completely on the harsh overhead lighting of the bridal suite to read their lips. David was putting on the absolute performance of a lifetime. His handsome face was a masterclass in manufactured grief and calculated sorrow. He let out a long, ragged sigh that made his broad shoulders slump forward in a show of heavy defeat before he began to speak. I watched his mouth move, enunciating every single syllable with a slow, deliberate cadence meant to convey deep paternal agony. "Your stepmother disappeared," he said. I could read the exact shape of the awful words forming on his lips. His expression twisted into a flawless mask of pure tragedy. Her mental illness finally took her. She ran away. The sheer audacity of his lie sent a fresh wave of nausea rolling through my stomach. I watched Brittany physically recoil on the velvet sofa as if she had just been slapped. Her hands flew up to cover her mouth, and her dark eyes widened in absolute shock. The white silk of her bridal robe shimmered under the chandelier as she shook her head back and forth, refusing to accept his words. She looked completely devastated. This was supposed to be the happiest morning of her life, and her father was poisoning it with a fabricated narrative of my betrayal. I pressed my fingertips against the cold wooden edge of the desk, wishing that I could smash my fist right through the monitor and shatter his lying face. David did not give his grieving daughter any time to process the massive emotional blow. He immediately moved closer to her, sliding smoothly across the deep sofa cushions until their knees finally touched. He reached out with his free hand and gently stroked her dark hair, playing the role of the protective, loving patriarch perfectly. I kept my eyes locked fiercely on his mouth as he delivered the next calculated psychological strike. "She always resented our bond, sweetheart," he whispered. He leaned in much closer, making sure he maintained intense, unwavering eye contact with her to ensure his manipulation took deep root. "She could not handle you getting the spotlight today." My breath caught painfully in my tight throat. He was taking my genuine, loving attempts to protect Brittany and twisting them into a toxic, jealous narrative. Every single time I had tried to shield her from his overbearing demands, every time I had questioned his control over her finances, he had painted me as the bitter outsider. He was weaponizing the very foundation of our blended family to isolate her. I watched Brittany drop her hands to her lap, her shoulders trembling as silent tears began to streak down her makeup. She looked small and vulnerable sitting there in that suite. David wrapped a comforting arm around her, pulling her against his chest, while his hand maintained a grip on the stack of legal documents. He let her cry against his shoulder for a few long moments before slowly pulling back and firmly tapping his index finger against the thick pile of paper resting on his knee. The camera angle shifted slightly as Brittany sat up, wiping her damp cheeks with the back of her trembling hand. David began speaking much more rapidly now, his face adopting an intense expression of urgent, desperate necessity. I focused all of my attention entirely on his lips, translating his frantic, urgent movements. "These are emergency power of attorney papers," he told her. "I need you to sign them right now to protect your trust fund from Courtney." He pointed an accusatory finger toward the heavy suite door, gesturing exactly as if I were a looming malicious threat waiting out in the hallway. "Her erratic flight proves she is not in her right mind. We have to completely secure your assets right now before she tries to steal your money." The absolute hypocrisy of his statement was staggering. He was actively orchestrating a theft of her entire inheritance and blaming the financial ruin on my disappearance. He was rushing her, pushing her to sign away her rights while she was drowning in the shock of my breakdown. I watched Brittany look down at the documents with confusion. She shook her head, gesturing toward the pages and mouthing a question. She was asking why they had to do this on the morning of her wedding. David pressed the papers into her lap, pulling a silver pen from the pocket of his tuxedo jacket. He was crowding her space, leaning over her to create a suffocating pressure. Brittany hesitated. She stared blankly down at the empty signature lines and then looked slowly back up at her father. Her natural instincts were desperately fighting against his sophisticated manipulation. She knew something felt fundamentally wrong about signing complex, sweeping legal documents while sitting there wearing her delicate bridal robe. I silently begged her through the screen to push the awful papers away, to demand a lawyer to simply stand up and walk right out of the room. Just as she crossed her bare arms over her chest, flatly refusing to take the offered silver pen, the heavy double doors of the suite opened wide again. Spencer walked directly into the frame. The groom was impeccably dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, his hair perfectly styled for the impending lavish ceremony. He crossed the large room with smooth, confident, measured strides. I watched closely as he quickly assessed the tense situation, taking in the sight of Brittany crying and the thick legal documents resting heavily on her lap. Spencer did not look at all surprised by the heavy, oppressive emotional atmosphere filling the room. He looked exactly like a man arriving right on schedule for his assigned crucial role in the scam. He sat down gracefully on the other side of Brittany, boxing her in completely between her manipulative father and her supposed future husband. Spencer reached out and placed a large, comforting hand gently over her bare shoulder. He leaned his handsome head against hers, wearing an incredibly soft, reassuring smile meant to disarm her completely. I watched his lips move slowly as he spoke quietly to her. His chosen words were incredibly gentle and disarmingly soothing. "We just want to make absolutely sure you are safe today," he told her. "We love you so very much." His physical presence in that exact moment was a brilliant masterstroke of psychological pressure. He was flawlessly playing the ultimate supportive, loving partner, wrapping her in a warm cocoon of false security while silently cornering her into complete, total submission. As the digital clock on the monitor ticked forward silently, Brittany looked back and forth desperately between the two powerful men she trusted most in the entire world. They had completely successfully isolated her, cutting her off from any outside perspective or rational independent thought. They were expertly using her deep love and her profound shock to completely blind her to the grim reality of their financial trap. I watched helplessly as Spencer gave her shoulder another gentle, encouraging squeeze. He nodded approvingly toward the silver pen David was still persistently holding out. The combined crushing weight of their expectations was simply too much for her to bear alone. Slowly, with a shaking, trembling hand, Brittany reached out and picked up the pen. I watched the silver tip of the pen touch the crisp white paper, and a primal scream crawled up the back of my throat. I swallowed it down, forcing the overwhelming and suffocating panic into a cold, hard, and singular focus. Screaming at a muted monitor would not save Brittany from the financial slaughter her father had meticulously orchestrated. I needed to strike where it would inflict the most catastrophic damage. I tore my eyes away from the heartbreaking scene playing out in the bridal suite and spun my rolling chair toward the primary server rack towering in the center of the chilled room. The heavy steel door of the network closet was firmly barricaded, but that physical barrier was only a temporary measure. I unzipped the front pocket of my stolen catering uniform and pulled out my ultralight auditing laptop, setting it flat on the metal desk next to the purloined burner phone. My fingers flew across the keyboard with a frantic and practiced muscle memory. I grabbed a thick blue Ethernet cable dangling from the main hotel switchboard and jammed it directly into the side port of my machine. The connection indicator flashed a brilliant green. I was securely hardwired directly into the central digital nervous system of the entire luxury resort. The hotel firewalls were robust and designed to keep casual hackers at bay, but they were absolutely no match for the proprietary forensic decryption software my firm used to dismantle corporate embezzlement rings. I launched the override sequence and watched as lines of dense green code cascaded rapidly down my black screen. The complex security protocols folded one by one, granting me completely unrestricted administrative access to the external outgoing network. I was no longer just a terrified, trapped woman hiding in a basement. I was a digital ghost, armed with the keys to David and his vast financial empire. I picked up the burner phone and linked its cloned data files directly to my laptop, bypassing the two-factor authentication gateways that David relied on to protect his offshore assets. A prompt flashed on my screen demanding the master encryption key. I typed in the sequence of alphanumeric characters I had painstakingly memorized during those endless, agonizing hours locked in his home office, under the guise of balancing his mundane domestic ledgers. A heavy mechanical hum echoed through the server room as the cooling fans kicked into overdrive. The screen blinked twice, and then the digital gates swung wide open. David possessed a sprawling web of interconnected financial accounts spanning across 3 different continents. I had unrestricted access to his personal checking, his corporate holding companies, his hidden shell corporations, and the massive predatory trust fund he had manipulated out of his late wife. I glanced sharply to my left, staring at the live security feed still running on the secondary monitor. Brittany was signing the first page of the power of attorney documents. Her hand moved slowly as if she were moving through thick mud. Spencer was hovering over her shoulder, nodding with a sickeningly sweet smile of fake reassurance. David stood beside them, practically vibrating with barely concealed triumph. He was seconds away from legally stripping his daughter of her entire inheritance and binding her to a man who was actively conspiring against her. Every stroke of her pen was sealing her fate. The sheer injustice of the scene fueled a raging fire in my chest. I turned my attention fiercely back to my laptop screen. I opened the master control terminal for the global banking syndicate that managed David and his vast portfolio. My hands were shaking, but my keystrokes were precise and deadly. I initiated a sequence I had only ever used in controlled simulations during my forensic training. I navigated to the Central Asset Management console and selected every single account linked to his primary Social Security number and corporate tax identification. Checking accounts, savings portfolios, international wire routing numbers, and domestic investment funds were all highlighted in a bright, aggressive red. I clicked the cursor on the overarching security tab. A drop-down menu appeared offering various levels of restrictive account action. I bypassed the standard fraud alerts and scrolled directly to the absolute bottom of the list. I selected the highest tier of financial lockdown available within the system architecture. It was a specialized protocol designated strictly for suspected federal wire fraud and international money laundering. Triggering this specific alert would not just temporarily pause his credit cards, it would instantly freeze every single liquid asset he possessed, locking him completely out of his own empire. It would automatically dispatch urgent flagged notifications to the federal authorities, the Internal Revenue Service, and the International Banking Commission. I hovered my cursor over the final execution command. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs. Once I initiated this catastrophic sequence, there was absolutely no turning back. David would be financially paralyzed, stripped of his power and his ability to pay off his mercenary security team. I looked at the security monitor one last time. Brittany was flipping to the final signature page of the vicious trap. I slammed my finger down on the Enter key, executing the master override command. A bold green confirmation banner flashed across the center of my laptop screen, verifying that the total asset freeze had been successfully initiated across all global platforms. A deep, fierce wave of vindication washed over me. But that sweet sensation of victory was violently cut short by a sudden blinding flash of red light illuminating the dark server room. The primary hotel network monitors, bolted to the wall above the desk, erupted into a chaotic frenzy of flashing warning sirens. Dense lines of red text began scrolling frantically across the massive screens. The digital alarms blared silently through the visual interface, indicating a massive critical security breach had just been detected within the internal framework. I froze, staring in horror as my own laptop screen flickered and dimmed. The specialized decryption software I was running began flashing urgent warning prompts. Someone else was inside the network. A highly skilled system administrator was actively tracking the source of the outgoing data burst, and they were moving with terrifying speed. I could practically feel the invisible presence of the security expert hunting me through the miles of fiber optic cables buried beneath the resort. They were isolating my digital footprint, isolating the specific server port I had commandeered. They had already identified the precise physical location of the rogue connection originating from this exact basement server closet. I watched my screen as a hostile remote terminal began forcibly terminating my active connections one by one. The unseen technician was deploying aggressive countermeasure protocols, trying to sever my hardline link and lock me out of the mainframe before the federal fraud flags could permanently lock down the final offshore accounts. I pounded my fingers against the keyboard, attempting to deploy a series of ghosting scripts to mask my exact terminal coordinates, but the local administrator held the ultimate home court advantage. A digital countdown timer materialized in the top right corner of my monitor, calculating the rapid deterioration of my firewall bypass. The numbers ticked down mercilessly. I had less than 3 minutes before my connection would be completely and permanently disconnected. 3 minutes before the remote administrator would trigger the physical security alarms and send David and his brutal enforcers charging down to the basement to break through that heavy steel door. The countdown dropped to 2 minutes and 45 seconds. I stopped wasting time on stealth and switched to brute force, flooding the hotel's administrative network with enough junk traffic to slow the technician down. It was messy, reckless, and loud, but it bought me the only thing I needed: seconds. The servers roared around me as warning boxes stacked across the screen. Every port was closing, every pathway was narrowing, and I knew the next move had to be final. I spared a frantic, panicked glance at the secondary monitor displaying the live security feed from the luxurious bridal suite. Brittany was holding the heavy silver pen poised directly over the final page of the thick legal stack. Her beautiful face was a heartbreaking portrait of complete emotional exhaustion and profound confusion. She looked incredibly small and vulnerable, sandwiched between the two towering men who were actively conspiring to destroy her entire future. David leaned forward, resting his elbows on his tailored knees. He reached out and gently rubbed his daughter's shoulder, offering a sickening display of warm paternal reassurance. Spencer stood slightly behind the plush velvet sofa, crossing his arms over his expensive suit. I watched closely as David tilted his handsome head up and caught Spencer's eye. A slow, terrifying smirk spread across the face of the billionaire. It was a look of pure, unfiltered arrogance and cold, predatory triumph. They had successfully broken her spirit. They had weaponized her immense grief and her genuine fear of my fabricated mental collapse to completely bypass her rational, independent judgment. Brittany pressed the sharp tip of the pen to the crisp white paper. I watched her hand move slowly, dragging the dark ink across the designated signature line. The irreversible legal transfer of power was officially complete. The massive wealth her mother had carefully set aside was now completely exposed. She let out a long, heavy sigh and handed the signed documents back to her father. David practically snatched the vital paperwork from her trembling hands. His eyes gleamed with a hungry, desperate energy. He immediately reached into the inner breast pocket of his tuxedo jacket and withdrew his personal smartphone. I knew exactly what he was doing in that very moment. The signed power of attorney documents were just the necessary legal shield to protect him from future litigation. He was going to use his encrypted banking application to manually authorize the immediate transfer of her $3 million trust fund directly into his newly secured and freshly laundered holding accounts. I had to beat his keystrokes before the transaction was verified by the centralized banking server. I snapped my full, undivided attention back to my auditing laptop. The flashing countdown timer read exactly 40 seconds. The furious system administrator was ruthlessly slicing through my digital interference, closing in rapidly on my primary extraction node. My chest heaved with shallow, panicked breaths as I navigated past the frozen corporate accounts and carefully isolated the specific routing prefix for the irrevocable trust fund established by Brittany's late mother. The current available balance glowed in bright green digital numbers: $3,200,000. I rapidly opened the secure transfer execution portal on my screen. I quickly typed in the highly encrypted routing sequence for a specialized offshore escrow account located deep in the Cayman Islands. It was a secure digital vault I had quietly established years ago during a particularly dangerous corporate embezzlement audit. I had specifically designed this ghost account for scenarios exactly like this one. The offshore account was virtually impenetrable to outside interference. It was intentionally designed to hold massive sums of disputed capital in total absolute stasis. It required a physical, multi-factor authentication process that culminated in a highly complex biometric scan. Absolutely no one could authorize a withdrawal or a wire transfer from that escrow vault without my living, breathing fingerprint and a verified retinal confirmation. The money would sit there entirely untouchable until I personally decided to release the funds back to the rightful legal owner. My laptop screen began to violently glitch and shudder as the firewall alarms screamed. The remote administrator was mere seconds away from completely severing my hardline connection to the outside world. The timer hit 15 excruciating seconds. I rapidly typed the final authorization command, ensuring the routing numbers matched perfectly. I took a deep, jagged breath and slammed my index finger down onto the execute key with enough physical force to bruise my knuckle. The plastic key clicked sharply, echoing in the empty room. A blue loading progress bar materialized on the center of the screen, fighting desperately against the collapsing network infrastructure. 10 seconds remaining. The progress bar crawled forward painfully slowly. 5 seconds remaining. The bar suddenly leaped and reached 100% just as the entire monitor went pitch black. The roaring cooling fans in the room abruptly spun down to a quiet, hollow hum. The system administrator had finally bypassed the software and physically cut the external network switch from the main building terminal. I was completely digitally severed from the outside world. My chest heaved violently as I gasped for air, pulling the blue Ethernet cable out of my machine. The sudden silence in the room was deafening. I dragged my exhausted, stinging eyes back up to the secondary monitor displaying the closed-circuit camera feed. The internal security cameras were running on an independent closed-loop system, completely unaffected by the external network shutdown. In the bright bridal suite, David was staring intensely down at his glowing smartphone screen. He tapped the smooth glass surface with his thumb, presumably refreshing the banking application to confirm the massive incoming wire transfer from his daughter's compromised trust. I held my breath watching the silent drama unfold through the grainy lens. I watched the arrogant, triumphant smirk slowly melt away from his handsome, aristocratic face. The healthy artificial tan color drained completely from his sharp cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His mouth opened in a silent, dramatic gasp of absolute, unadulterated horror. He frantically tapped the screen again and again, his movements growing wildly uncoordinated and desperate. He shook the device, stepping away from Brittany and staring at the display as if it had just physically burned him. His master account balance, the total accumulated sum of his vast liquid empire and his stolen acquisitions, read exactly $0.00. I had taken everything. Brittany and Spencer were still talking quietly on the velvet sofa, oblivious to the financial slaughter. David abruptly shoved the phone back into his tuxedo jacket pocket. He ran a shaking hand through his perfectly styled hair, ruining the expensive aesthetic. I could see the sheer panic radiating from his stiff posture. He muttered something brief to Spencer, pointing a thumb back toward the heavy double doors of the bridal suite. He was making a hasty excuse, claiming some last-minute wedding emergency required his immediate attention. He practically sprinted out of the room, leaving his daughter alone with the man who was supposed to be her financial jailer. Brittany and Spencer were still talking quietly on the velvet sofa, oblivious to the financial slaughter. David abruptly shoved the phone back into his tuxedo jacket pocket. He ran a shaking hand through his perfectly styled hair, ruining the expensive aesthetic. I could see the sheer panic radiating from his stiff, rigid posture. He muttered something brief to Spencer, pointing a thumb back toward the heavy double doors of the bridal suite. He was making a hasty excuse, claiming some last-minute wedding emergency that required his immediate attention. He practically sprinted out of the room, leaving his daughter alone with the man who was supposed to be her financial jailer. I reached forward and clicked the mouse, dragging my cursor across the grid of security camera feeds. I switched my primary view from the bridal suite down to the opulent main lobby of the resort. The grand foyer was a breathtaking display of excessive wealth. Towering crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the polished marble floors. A string quartet played softly in the corner. Men in sharp black tuxedos and women in sweeping designer gowns were mingling near the sweeping staircase. The massive solid mahogany doors leading into the primary ballroom remained firmly shut. Standing directly in front of those closed doors were two imposing figures. One was the head caterer, a severe woman holding a thick leather clipboard. Beside her stood the elite floral designer. As the elevator doors chimed open across the lobby, David stumbled out. He was openly hyperventilating now, tugging desperately at his stiff collar, as if the expensive silk bow tie was actively choking him. A thin sheen of nervous sweat coated his pale forehead. He tried to force his shoulders back and adopt his usual mask of arrogant authority, but the terrifying reality of his empty bank accounts was completely destroying his composure. He marched across the marble floor, heading straight for the ballroom doors. He needed to get inside to find a quiet place to call his offshore bankers. But the two vendors stepped smoothly forward, physically blocking his path. I leaned closer to the monitor, watching the tense interaction unfold. The head caterer tapped her pen against her clipboard, her expression completely devoid of warmth or compromise. I could read her lips as she spoke to him. She was adamantly demanding the absolute final payment for her services. The contract stated the remaining balance had to be settled in full before the ballroom doors would be opened to the guests. The floral designer nodded in firm agreement, crossing his arms over his chest. He was refusing to allow anyone inside to see his flowers until his massive outstanding invoice was cleared. David let out a harsh, arrogant laugh that looked painfully forced on the silent camera feed. He waved his hand dismissively. He reached into his pocket and produced a sleek wallet. He pulled out a heavy, solid metal platinum credit card and shoved it aggressively into the hands of the caterer. She did not blink or back down from his aggressive posturing. She simply produced a wireless mobile payment terminal from her blazer pocket and smoothly inserted the heavy platinum card. The small screen on the terminal lit up, displaying the processing notification. David stood there with a smug, expectant smile plastered across his face. He adjusted his cufflinks, waiting for the inevitable approval. Instead, a sharp, piercing beep echoed through the lobby. The caterer looked down at the screen and then looked back up at David. She shook her head and held the terminal up so he could read the bold red text himself. Declined. David froze. His mouth dropped open in shock. He quickly shook his head, gesturing wildly with his hands. He was clearly blaming the machine, claiming it was a simple banking error. He snatched the first card back and immediately pulled a second card from his wallet. This one was an exclusive black card tied directly to his primary corporate accounts. He thrust it at the caterer with a trembling hand, demanding she run it again. The woman remained completely unimpressed by his display of wealth. She calmly inserted the black card into the payment terminal. The machine processed the information for a few agonizing seconds. The same sharp, rejecting beep rang out again. Declined. The absolute impossibility of the situation finally shattered the last remaining fragments of his manufactured sanity. David completely lost his mind. He lunged forward, jabbing his finger furiously into the face of the head caterer. His face turned a dangerous bright shade of crimson. He began loudly screaming. The camera captured the sheer, ugly rage contorting his features. He was demanding they open the doors, threatening to ruin their businesses, threatening to sue them into absolute poverty. He waved his useless credit cards in the air like weapons. The commotion was so loud the entire lobby fell into a shocked, dead silence. Dozens of wealthy elite guests stopped drinking and turned to stare. They watched in absolute stunned disbelief as the supposedly refined billionaire threw a massive screaming temper tantrum over a declined catering bill. The floral designer stepped forward, placing himself protectively between David and the caterer. He pointed a stern warning finger at David, telling him to back away. The designer then gestured toward his crew, waiting near the side exit, giving the undeniable signal to begin packing up the arrangements. If they were not getting paid, the wedding reception was officially over before it even started. David stumbled backward, physically retreating from the firm stance of the vendors. He looked around the lobby, suddenly realizing that his entire social circle was watching his humiliating financial destruction. The sheer terror in his eyes was absolute. His mind, wildly spinning out of control, tried to rationalize how his multi-million-dollar empire had vanished into thin air in minutes. He could not process the highly sophisticated digital attack I had just orchestrated. His arrogant mind immediately jumped to the only logical human target he could blame for this catastrophic failure. He assumed that I had somehow managed to manually steal the money from his physical safe or wire it out before fleeing the state. In a state of pure, blind, sweating panic, he ripped his phone out of his pocket and jabbed his thumb against the screen. I zoomed the camera feed in close on his face, watching his jaw clench as he raised the phone to his ear. He was dialing the emergency dispatcher at 911. He began pacing in tight, frantic circles near the staircase, ignoring the horrified stares of his wedding guests. When the emergency dispatcher answered, he started screaming into the receiver. He reported me as a missing, severely mentally unstable thief. He shouted that his deranged wife had just robbed him of his entire life savings and was actively on the run. He demanded that the police dispatch units immediately to track me down and arrest me. On the camera feed, David looked down at his banking app one last time, praying for a miracle. The color drained completely from his face once again. His master account balance still read exactly $0.00. 5 hours later, the digital clock in the bottom corner of my security monitor glowed with a harsh, bright light. My legs were completely numb from sitting on the cold metal floor of the server room, but I refused to look away from the screen for even a single second. The scene playing out in the grand ballroom was a masterpiece of manufactured high society elegance. Despite his complete financial annihilation, David had somehow managed to bully or manipulate the hotel management into opening the massive mahogany doors. I assumed he had either leveraged Spencer and his wealthy family to front the immediate catering costs, or he had deployed his usual venomous threats of future litigation to force the vendors into temporary compliance. Whatever desperate lies he had spun, the lavish wedding reception was now in absolutely full swing. The bright, glowing crystal chandeliers cast a very warm and welcoming light over the beautifully decorated tables, completely hiding the dark, ugly truth of the event from the wealthy attendees. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated effortlessly through the massive room, carrying silver trays loaded with crystal flutes of expensive champagne. The elite guests were completely oblivious to the catastrophic reality hiding just beneath the surface of the celebration. They laughed and clinked their glasses together, celebrating a union built entirely on theft and deception. A professional string quartet was positioned on a raised velvet stage in the far corner of the ballroom. They played a continuous selection of soft classical music that drifted smoothly over the low hum of wealthy conversation. I zoomed the camera in on the head table positioned at the center of the room. Brittany sat rigidly in her delicate white gown, staring blankly at the massive floral centerpiece blocking her view of the dance floor. She looked like a beautiful, empty shell. The psychological manipulation she had endured in the bridal suite had completely drained the life from her eyes. Spencer sat close beside her, playing his assigned role flawlessly. He constantly touched her bare shoulder and whispered softly into her ear, ensuring she remained docile and compliant. He was the perfect picture of a devoted new husband, keeping a tight physical grip on his highly lucrative investment. I dragged my cursor across the screen and switched to a different camera angle, scanning the wide room for David. I found him hovering nervously near the massive arched windows at the back of the ballroom. He was holding a heavy crystal tumbler of dark liquor, gripping the thick glass so tightly his knuckles were stark white. His tuxedo jacket was unbuttoned, and the stiff collar of his crisp white shirt was slightly rumpled. He was putting on a desperate performance for his wealthy peers, forcing a rigid artificial smile whenever a guest approached to offer their warm congratulations. But the exact moment they turned away, his smile would instantly vanish, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. He was constantly reaching into his pocket to check his phone, obsessively refreshing his empty banking applications, and waiting for the police to call him back with news of my capture. He honestly believed I was currently fleeing toward an international airport with his stolen millions packed securely into a duffel bag. The digital clock ticked forward relentlessly. The classical music swelled beautifully as the string quartet began a new lively piece meant to draw the guests out onto the polished wooden dance floor. Several elegantly dressed couples began moving toward the center of the room, laughing and holding hands. I leaned much closer to the monitor, resting my chin heavily on my folded hands. And then the heavy mahogany doors at the main entrance of the ballroom violently swung wide open. The sudden aggressive movement caught the immediate attention of the guests standing near the grand entryway. The lead violinist of the string quartet faltered, dragging his bow harshly across the delicate strings with a loud discordant screech. The rest of the musicians quickly stopped playing, plunging the massive room into a sudden heavy silence. I watched closely as four distinct figures marched deliberately through the wide open doorway. Three of them were uniformed police officers, their heavy black boots thudding loudly against the pristine wooden dance floor. They were led by a tall, broad-shouldered detective wearing a cheap gray suit and a completely grim expression. The sudden jarring appearance of law enforcement in the absolute middle of a high society wedding reception sent an immediate shockwave of sheer horror through the elegant crowd. The wealthy guests gasped aloud, stepping back quickly and pulling their expensive silk gowns out of the way as the officers marched straight into the direct center of the room. A frantic rising wave of panicked whispering rippled rapidly through the tense ballroom. I quickly switched the camera angle back to David. He had completely frozen near the tall windows, his glass of dark liquor halted halfway to his open mouth. For one split second, sheer, terrifying terror flashed across his pale face. He clearly thought the authorities had finally discovered his massive offshore money laundering operation. But then his deeply arrogant mind rapidly course-corrected. He remembered his frantic emergency phone call from the hotel lobby. He remembered the desperate, unhinged narrative he had spun to the emergency dispatcher about his deranged, thieving wife. A fresh new wave of manufactured confidence instantly washed over his sharp features. He slammed his crystal glass down hard onto a nearby cocktail table and immediately launched into the absolute greatest theatrical performance of his entire life. He pushed his way aggressively through the thick crowd of horrified guests, shoving important people aside in his desperate haste to reach the center of the empty dance floor. He forced a look of pure devastated agony onto his handsome face. He actually managed to produce genuine crocodile tears, letting them spill dramatically down his cheeks as he rushed forward to meet the lead detective. He threw his hands up high in the air, playing the tragic role of the deeply traumatized and victimized patriarch to absolute flawless perfection. He closed the remaining distance and stopped directly in front of the tall detective, letting out a loud, ragged sigh of manufactured relief. "Thank God you are here," he said, his voice shaking with fake emotional exhaustion. He placed a trembling hand over his racing heart, making sure the surrounding elite guests could hear his every single spoken word. "Did you find my deranged wife?" he begged, wiping a single tear from his eye. "Did you catch her at the airport?" The three uniformed police officers simply stared at him, their large hands resting casually near their heavy utility belts. The tall lead detective did not offer a single ounce of polite comfort or human reassurance. He did not pull out a small notepad or ask for a detailed physical description of the suspected fugitive. He just stood there, planted firmly on the polished wooden floor, looking down at David. The heavy, suffocating silence in the massive ballroom was absolutely deafening. Every single well-dressed guest was holding their collective breath, waiting anxiously for the dramatic resolution to this sudden, terrifying public scandal. I watched the live video feed, holding my own breath in the freezing server room, anticipating the glorious, inevitable downfall. The lead detective looks at David with a deadpan expression. "Sir," the detective says, his voice echoing in the silent ballroom, "we are not here for your wife." David blinked twice. His perfectly constructed mask of paternal grief completely shattered, leaving behind a raw and ugly expression of total confusion. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words died in his tight throat. The three uniformed officers fanned out slightly, creating a physical barrier between the frantic billionaire and the main exit. A collective gasp rippled through the massive ballroom. The wealthy elite guests were entirely unaccustomed to the harsh reality of law enforcement invading their sacred spaces. The absolute shock paralyzed the room. Whispers erupted like dry leaves catching fire. At the head table, the heavy silence was finally broken by the scraping of a wooden chair violently pushed back against the polished marble floor. Spencer's mother stood up. She was a formidable society matriarch draped in heavy diamonds and icy superiority. Her sharp eyes darted from the uniformed officers standing in the center of the dance floor to David's sweating, pale face. She gripped her expensive silk clutch so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her husband rose slowly beside her, adjusting his tailored suit with a look of profound disgust. They were old-money aristocrats who dealt in quiet, backroom handshakes and completely despised public scandal. The sheer presence of police marching through their son's wedding reception was the ultimate unforgivable insult. She stepped out from behind the long table, her heels clicking sharply. She glared at David with absolute contempt. "This is a social disaster," she hissed. Her voice was not loud, but it carried a razor-sharp edge that cut perfectly through the murmuring crowd. Everyone in the immediate vicinity heard her harsh judgment. "We will not be tied to a family with such criminal elements." She turned her nose up and signaled to her husband, "We are leaving immediately." The direct threat of the wealthy family walking out was the absolute final nail in the coffin of David's sanity. His entire master plan hinged entirely on this specific alliance. The marriage to Spencer was supposed to legitimize his stolen wealth and grant him immediate access to a network of old money investors who could easily keep his failing shell companies afloat. If they walked out those ballroom doors right now, he would lose absolutely everything he had worked so ruthlessly to build. He completely forgot about the stoic detective standing mere feet away. He completely forgot about the hundreds of eyes watching his every single move. A raw, desperate animal panic overtook his senses. He spun around and locked his wild eyes directly on his daughter. Brittany was still sitting frozen at the head table, clutching the delicate fabric of her white bridal gown. Her chest heaved with shallow, terrified breaths as she watched her new in-laws prepare to abandon her. David marched toward her with heavy, aggressive strides. The polished facade of the loving father vanished, entirely replaced by the vicious, tyrannical monster I had come to know so intimately. He reached the table and leaned aggressively over the lush, floral arrangements. He violently grabbed her bare arm. His thick fingers dug ruthlessly into her pale skin. Brittany cried out in sudden, genuine pain, trying instinctively to pull back, but his physical grip was like a steel vice. He yanked her, forcing her to stand and face the retreating in-laws. "This is your fault," he spat directly into her face. Droplets of saliva flew from his lips. "You and your ridiculous attachment to that crazy stepmother of yours. You brought this chaos into our lives. You let her poison you against me, and now she is trying to destroy our entire family from the shadows. You have to fix this mess right now." Brittany stared at him with wide, horrified eyes. A fresh wave of tears spilled over her dark eyelashes, ruining her perfect bridal makeup. She shook her head desperately, trying to break his painful hold on her arm. "Dad, you are hurting me," she pleaded. Her voice was a fragile, broken whisper that echoed softly through the shocked silence of the room. David completely ignored her pain. His face was inches from hers, contorted with an ugly, sweaty desperation. He pointed a trembling finger toward Spencer's parents, who had paused near the exit to watch the horrifying domestic dispute unfold. They were watching him self-destruct with cold, calculating eyes. "You have to show them we are financially stable," he demanded. His voice was a harsh, raspy growl. "You have to transfer the dowry funds immediately to appease Spencer's family. You have to show them that the trust fund is secure and that we honor our financial commitments. Pull out your phone and initiate the wire transfer right now. Brittany, or I swear to God you will have absolutely nothing left." He was completely unhinged, demanding she hand over the very money he had already tried to steal. He was banking on the faint hope that the banking error was localized to his phone and that she still had access to the millions. I moved my eyes to Spencer. He was standing less than 2 feet away from his terrified new bride. He had full visibility of David's bruising grip on her arm. He could clearly see the sheer terror in her eyes. Yet the handsome young groom did absolutely nothing. He just stood there, spineless and pathetic, crossing his arms tightly over his chest and looking away. He was actively choosing to protect his own pristine public image rather than defend the woman he had just sworn to cherish and protect. He let David continue to aggressively berate and manhandle his new bride without offering a single word of protest or a single physical intervention. Brittany sobbed openly, now her delicate shoulders shaking violently as the grim reality of her total isolation finally crushed her spirit. She was completely surrounded by hundreds of prominent people, but she was utterly profoundly alone. The absolute betrayal by the man she loved tore her heart into jagged pieces. She looked at Spencer with a desperate, silent plea for help, but he kept his gaze firmly fixed on the polished marble floor, avoiding her eyes entirely. David shook her arm again, causing her to stumble slightly against the heavy wooden table. "Do it right now," he screamed, his voice cracking with manic pressure. The loud, aggressive sound finally broke the spell of shocked paralysis that had gripped the room. I watched the live security feed from the freezing server room gripping the edge of my desk. Heavy boots thudded rapidly against the floorboards. The lead detective did not say another word as he closed the remaining distance. He moved with a swift, practiced authority, slicing directly through the thick tension. He stepped firmly between the furious billionaire and the weeping bride. The detective reached out with a large, calloused hand and clamped it down hard directly over David's wrist. With a swift, brutal twist, the detective physically broke David's vice-like grip on Brittany's arm, forcing the older man to stumble backward in shock. Brittany collapsed back into her padded chair, sobbing into her hands as the detective stepped squarely into David's personal space. The officer reached to the back of his duty belt and pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The silver metal gleamed brightly under the crystal chandeliers. The metal links clinked together with a sharp, cold finality. "David Blackwell," the detective announces loudly, his deep voice booming across the silent ballroom. "You are under arrest." David's jaw dropped so fast it appeared as though the hinges of his bones had snapped. He stared at the cold steel handcuffs dangling from the thick fingers of the lead detective. The harsh reality of those silver rings failed to penetrate his layer of absolute arrogance. He genuinely believed his vast wealth and towering social status provided an invisible shield against the indignity of ordinary law enforcement. He blinked rapidly, trying to force the hallucination to end, but the stern detective remained planted in front of him. A strained, harsh laugh bubbled up from David's chest. It was a terrible grating sound that echoed awkwardly across the silence of the grand ballroom. He took a clumsy step backward, bumping heavily against the head table. "Arrested." For what he demanded, his voice rising to a frantic pitch. "My wife is the thief. She just robbed my entire estate blind and fled the state. You should be at the airport hunting her down, not harassing an innocent man at his daughter's wedding reception." The lead detective did not flinch or react to the sudden verbal assault. He moved forward with practiced clinical efficiency. He grabbed David by the shoulder, spinning the billionaire around with a sudden, forceful motion that caused the expensive tuxedo jacket to wrinkle and pull tight. David let out a loud, undignified yelp of pure shock as his right arm was forcefully twisted behind his back. The cold steel cuff snapped shut around his thick wrist with a sharp metallic click that resonated through the massive room. The absolute finality of that sound sent a violent, visible shudder down David's spine. He tried to physically resist, planting his expensive leather shoes firmly on the polished dance floor and throwing his weight backward. The three uniformed officers instantly moved in, surrounding him like a solid wall of dark blue authority. They grabbed his shoulders and his free arm, pinning him firmly in place. "You are making a massive mistake, David," hissed his face, pressing awkwardly toward the floral arrangements on the table. "Do you have any idea who I am? I will have your badge for this. I will personally see to it that you are completely ruined." The detective secured the second cuff around David's left wrist, locking his hands securely together behind his back. The detective took a step back, adjusting his own gray suit jacket, and pulled a small folded piece of paper from his inner breast pocket. He completely ignored the frantic, empty threats flying from the mouth of the desperate billionaire. He looked David directly in the eyes, his expression a mask of absolute deadpan professionalism. "You have the right to remain silent." The detective began, his deep, steady voice carrying effortlessly across the vast open expanse of the ballroom. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. Do you understand the rights I have just read to you? David thrashed violently against the firm grip of the uniformed officers. I understand that you are making the biggest mistake of your entire pathetic career. He screamed, his voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated panic. I am a pillar of this community. I demand to know the exact charges you are fabricating against me. The detective slowly folded the piece of paper and slipped it back into his pocket. He looked at David with a gaze so incredibly cold, it seemed to lower the temperature in the entire room. David Blackwell, you are being placed under formal arrest for multiple counts of felony wire fraud, the detective announced loudly, ensuring every single wealthy guest in the room could hear the exact nature of the crimes. The words hung heavily in the air. A collective sharp intake of breath swept through the crowd. Men in sharp tuxedos exchanged worried, panicked glances. Women in sweeping designer gowns covered their mouths in absolute horror. The detective did not stop there. You are also being charged with aggravated elder abuse. The detective continued, his voice cutting cleanly through the rising wave of panicked whispers. The sheer weight of that specific charge caused a visible physical reaction from Brittany. She gasped loudly, covering her mouth with her trembling hands as she stared at her father in total, horrified disbelief. She knew exactly who the victim of that terrible abuse had to be. David stopped struggling. The color drained entirely from his flushed, angry face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His mouth opened and closed silently, like a suffocating fish. He looked around the room, seeing the immediate harsh judgment and sudden disgust radiating from his wealthy peers. The final charge, the detective said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register that commanded absolute attention, is conspiracy to commit attempted murder. The entire ballroom completely erupted. The polite, hushed whispers instantly transformed into a chaotic, roaring cacophony of sheer panic and disgust. Guests physically recoiled, stepping further away from the dance floor as if David was suddenly radioactive. The word murder hung in the bright golden light of the crystal chandeliers, poisoning the very air they breathed. Spencer took a massive, terrified step backward, putting as much physical distance between himself and David as possible. He looked at his new father-in-law with an expression of pure, unfiltered revulsion. He wanted absolutely nothing to do with this catastrophic social nightmare. David snapped his head back to face the detective, his eyes wide and completely unhinged. The sheer impossibility of his situation finally broke the last remaining threads of his rational thought. The blood rushed back into his face, turning his skin a dangerous bright crimson. The veins in his thick neck bulged visibly against his stiff white collar. This is a mistake, he screamed, thrashing wildly against the unyielding grip of the three strong officers. This is a massive, completely fabricated mistake. You have absolutely no proof of these insane allegations. Someone has set me up. Someone is trying to destroy my entire life and steal my hard-earned legacy. He kicked his polished leather shoes against the floorboard, fighting like a cornered, desperate animal. The uniformed officers simply tightened their firm grip, pulling him up straight and preventing him from collapsing onto the polished wood. You cannot just march into a private elite event and put handcuffs on a prominent citizen based on wild, malicious fantasies, David bellowed, his voice growing increasingly hoarse and ragged. He turned his head, frantically scanning the sea of horrified faces surrounding him, desperately searching for a sympathetic ally to save him. He looked directly at Spencer, pleading silently with his eyes, but Spencer immediately turned away, pretending he had not seen the desperate, silent plea. David let out a loud, guttural cry of pure, dark frustration. He jerked his head back toward the stoic lead detective. David screamed, his face red with rage. This is a mistake. Who authorized this investigation? Show me the warrant. The unbearable tension in the grand ballroom shattered. Everyone froze, waiting in absolute shock. Then the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung open with a violent crash, slamming against the white plastered walls. Every head turned at once. A clear, steady voice echoed through the hall. I authorized it. I stepped out of the vestibule and into the bright golden light of the grand ballroom. I was no longer wearing the catering uniform I had used to slip past the security perimeter. I had discarded the pants and apron in a service hallway 15 minutes ago. Instead, I wore a sharp, tailored charcoal gray suit. It was the exact armor I wore during my most ruthless corporate audits. I did not look like a broken, deranged woman fleeing into the night. I looked like a woman who was in absolute control of the room. Flanking me on my left was my own high-powered legal team consisting of 3 corporate litigators. Flanking me on my right were 2 federal agents wearing dark suits and carrying official FBI Financial Fraud Division credentials. Our heavy footsteps moved in perfect unison against the polished floorboards as we marched straight down the center aisle. The crowd of elite guests parted immediately, creating a wide path for us. They shrank back against the tables, staring at me with absolute shock. I kept my eyes locked directly on David. The color had completely drained from his face for the 3rd time tonight. His jaw hung slack and his chest stopped moving entirely. He looked like a man who was seeing a literal ghost. Beside the head table, Barbara let out a terrified gasp. She gripped the back of an empty chair, her knuckles turning stark white as her perfectly constructed world began to collapse around her. Brittany remained seated, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. She looked back and forth between my calm expression and her father, who was currently sweating in handcuffs. I reached the edge of the polished dance floor and stopped just a few feet away from the lead detective. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not match the unhinged, manic energy David had been projecting for the past 10 minutes. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket and withdrew my smartphone. The ballroom was completely silent, waiting for me to speak. Instead of arguing with a man who was already caught in a web of his own lies, I looked over at the raised velvet stage. Directly behind the musicians hung 3 massive blank presentation screens set up to display a slideshow of the happy couple later in the evening. I tapped my smartphone screen twice, syncing my device to the central audiovisual system of the resort. The massive presentation screens behind the wedding band instantly flickered to life. A bright white light washed over the terrified faces of the guests. I projected the undeniable financial ledgers for all 300 elite guests to plainly see. The documents were magnified to 20 feet tall, making every single routing number and transaction date impossible to misinterpret. I had spent hours meticulously tracing the hidden digital pathways and laid them out in a crystal-clear format. The screens displayed the exact balance of the irrevocable trust fund established by Brittany's late mother. Beside that number was a complex web of offshore holding accounts, shell corporations, and dummy LLCs that traced directly back to David and Barbara. The massive crowd of wealthy aristocrats began to murmur as they read the damning proof projected above them. They were business leaders and financial experts who understood exactly what they were looking at. The screens showed the systematic, brutal draining of Brittany's inheritance over the past 6 months. Every single stolen dollar was meticulously routed to artificially inflate David and Barbara's rapidly failing luxury enterprises. The undeniable evidence of their complete financial ruin and subsequent theft was laid bare for their circle to consume. The murmurs grew into a loud wave of absolute disgust. I watched the elite guests actively turning their backs on David, whispering harshly to one another about his profound betrayal. David realized in a fraction of a second that his financial fraud was completely exposed. He knew he could not argue with the routing numbers glowing brightly on the 20-foot screens. He tried to violently pivot the narrative. He thrashed against the strong grip of the police officers, pulling his handcuffed wrists up. "She is lying!" he screamed at the top of his lungs. His voice echoed harshly, bouncing off the high ceilings of the ballroom. "Those documents are completely fabricated. She hacked my accounts and manipulated the data to frame me." He was spitting as he yelled, his face turning a deep mottled purple. He looked frantically at the horrified guests, desperately trying to find a single sympathetic face in the massive crowd. When he realized that no one was stepping forward to defend him, he unleashed his ultimate venomous accusation. She poisoned my mother, he bellowed, pointing his chin in my direction. He strained against the officers, kicking his polished shoes against the wooden floorboards. She is completely insane. She has been trying to destroy my family for months. She murdered my mother, and now she is trying to frame me for financial crimes to cover her tracks. Do not listen to a single word she says. She is a deranged killer. The heavy accusation sent another shockwave through the room. Several guests gasped aloud, stepping even further away from the dance floor. Brittany let out a broken sob, covering her face with her hands. The lead detective tightened his grip on David, looking over at me with a cautious expression. He was waiting to see how I would react to the severe criminal allegation. I did not flinch. I did not offer a heated denial or a passionate defense of my character. I calmly reached into my right front pocket. I pulled my final weapon from my pocket and held it up for the room to see. It was my standard issue corporate audit hidden camera pen. It looked like an ordinary expensive silver writing instrument, but it contained a highly sophisticated microcamera and audio recorder. I took 2 slow steps and handed the silver pen to the lead detective. I instructed him to plug the hidden USB drive located under the cap directly into his secure tablet. The detective did so without hesitation. He synced the video file to the resort's projection system, overriding my previous financial ledgers. The ballroom plunged into total darkness for a brief second before the massive 20-foot screens lit up again. The high-definition video began to play, displaying a crystal-clear view of the luxurious dining room in our house. The guests watched in absolute stunned silence as the hidden camera footage showed David standing near the dining table. He was looking over his shoulder with a paranoid, nervous energy, making sure the room was completely empty. Then the massive screen showed him reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small, crumpled paper packet. He leaned over my steaming bowl of soup and carefully poured the fine white powder into the broth. The camera captured the cold, calculated look of absolute malice on his face as he stirred the poison into my food, ensuring it dissolved completely. The video looped, playing the undeniable act of attempted murder a second time for the entire room to witness. The absolute finality of the footage crushed the last remaining breath of air out of the grand ballroom. David stopped struggling against the officers. He stared up at the massive projection of his monstrous crime, his mouth hanging wide open in silent, total defeat. The lead detective gave a sharp nod to his men, and they immediately yanked David backward. The sudden movement broke the spell that had paralyzed the room. A chaotic chorus of shrieks and shouted questions erupted from the wealthy crowd. David snapped out of his catatonic state and began to fight again with a renewed feral intensity. He kicked and thrashed, his expensive tuxedo jacket tearing at the seam as he screamed obscenities at me. He demanded that someone call his lawyers and threatened to ruin everyone in the room who dared to watch his downfall. The officers ignored his frantic raving completely. They practically carried him across the polished marble floor toward the heavy oak doors. His polished leather shoes scuffed wildly against the ground, leaving long black marks on the pristine surface. The society matriarchs and elite investors he had spent decades trying to impress now turned their backs on him, whispering harshly about his absolute ruin. His reputation, the one thing he valued above all else, was instantly and irrevocably annihilated in front of the exact people he needed most. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind him, cutting off his hysterical shouting and leaving a heavy, buzzing tension in his wake. I kept my posture perfectly straight and calmly turned my attention toward the head table. Spencer was already moving quickly. The handsome groom smoothed the lapels of his designer suit and plastered an incredibly fake mask of deep concern across his face. He could see the millions of dollars he had been promised slipping rapidly through his fingers, and his selfish instinct for self-preservation kicked into overdrive. He rushed over to Brittany, who was still sitting frozen in her chair, staring at the blank spot where her toxic father had just been standing. Spencer dropped to one knee beside her, grabbing her trembling hands in his own. He leaned in close, his voice dripping with an artificial sugary sweetness that made my stomach turn. "Brittany, darling, We have to keep our heads, he murmured softly, ensuring the remaining guests could see him playing the role of the devoted, supportive husband. This is a terrible, scandalous nightmare, but we can still salvage the reception. We just need to smile and assure the investors that our family alliances remain strong. We need to secure your trust fund transfers before the authorities freeze all the estate assets. We can leave for our honeymoon tonight and let the lawyers handle this mess. Just stand up with me and show them we are united. Brittany looked down at Spencer as if she was seeing him for the very first time. The tears that had been welling in her dark eyes suddenly stopped falling completely. The terrified, fragile girl who had always bent to greedy men completely vanished in an instant. She pulled her hands from his grip, leaving him confused. He reached for her again, but she stood up, pushing her chair back with a loud scrape. She glared at the man who only cared about securing wire transfers during her trauma. Brittany grabbed the stem of a crystal champagne flute and reached for the massive diamond engagement ring weighing down her finger. The silver metal caught the light as she slid it off. Spencer stood up, his face twisting into a mask of pure panic. "Brittany, what are you doing?" he asked, losing his polished edge. "Do not make a scene." She did not speak a single word. She held the heavy ring over his half-full glass and simply let it go. The stone dropped into the bubbling liquid with a sharp clink, sending a small splash over the rim. "We are done," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound, undeniable power. "I am not your bank account, and I am certainly not your wife." Brittany picked up the layers of her white gown and stepped around him. She walked away from the head table, away from the wealthy guests, and away from the toxic life planned for her. She walked straight toward me, and I saw a genuine, grateful smile spread across her face. We walked out of the resort together, leaving their completely shattered grand illusions entirely behind us. 6 months later, the crisp autumn air swept through the busy streets of the city. The chaotic fallout from the wedding had dominated the news cycle for weeks, but the passage of time had finally brought a profound sense of peace. Authorities moved swiftly once the evidence was handed over. The investigation ripped through the estate, uncovering decades of fraud. Barbara never made it back to her luxurious mansion. She currently faced multiple counts of elder fraud from a guarded hospital bed in a state-run facility. Her failing health did not protect her from the severe legal consequences of her actions. She spent her days entirely alone, stripped of her expensive jewelry and her false sense of superiority. David faced an even bleaker reality. The billionaire who once commanded rooms was currently sitting in a cold concrete federal detention cell, awaiting a massive criminal trial. He was denied bail entirely due to his vast offshore connections and the violent nature of the attempted murder charge. His entire financial empire had collapsed under the sheer weight of the federal audits. The government quickly seized his properties and immediately froze his accounts and liquidated remaining assets to pay back the investors he had defrauded. He was completely and utterly bankrupt. The men who drank his scotch completely abandoned him the moment the handcuffs clicked shut. He had absolutely nothing left but the orange jumpsuit on his back and the terrifying reality of spending the rest of his natural life behind bars. I sat in my sunlit corner office taking a sip of coffee. Sunlight poured through the windows, bathing the space that belonged entirely to me. I adjusted the collar of my tailored navy suit and looked over the quarterly projections. The heavy glass door swung open, and Brittany walked in carrying a cardboard tube. The dark circles that used to haunt her eyes were gone, replaced by a bright, energetic spark. She unrolled the tube, spreading a set of architectural blueprints across my mahogany desk. "Take a look at these," she said. "I just finished the structural plans for the new community center. We just need to finalize the budget before we submit the official bids." I leaned forward and studied the complex designs. Brittany had used her fully restored trust fund to start her own independent architecture business. She was finally building the career she dreamed of, free from suffocating elite societal expectations. And I was sitting across from her, serving as her chief financial officer. I ensured her wealth was protected by an ironclad fortress of legal security. I looked up from the blueprints, offering a proud smile. "The budget is balanced," I told her. You are officially ready to build. Brittany let out a joyful laugh and signed the approval forms. I leaned back in my comfortable chair looking out at the city skyline. I did not just survive their trap. I burned their house of cards to the ground and built an empire on the ashes. The ashes of David's empire teach us a profound truth about power betrayal and the illusion of control in our lives. For years, the people who were supposed to nurture us instead used our lives as stepping stones for their own greed and vanity. They operated under the arrogant assumption that silence meant submission and that victims would forever remain helpless victims. But true strength is not always loud. It is often found in the quiet, meticulous gathering of resources and the patience to wait for the perfect moment to strike. This story is a testament to the fact that you do not have to accept the role a toxic family assigns to you. Brittany was conditioned to be a pawn, a fragile girl meant to secure a corrupt financial alliance. Yet when faced with the undeniable truth, she found the courage to drop the ring and walk away. She realized that walking away from a poisoned legacy is not a failure. It is the ultimate victory. Revenge in its sweetest form is not merely about destroying those who wronged you. It is about reclaiming your narrative and building something beautiful on your own terms. We did not just tear down a corrupt foundation, we constructed an independent, thriving future where their toxic influence could never reach us again. True family is built on mutual respect and genuine support, not manipulation and financial extraction. If you have ever been underestimated, silenced, or betrayed by the very people who should have had your back, I want to hear from you. If you have ever had to walk away from toxic expectations to build your own empire, share your story of resilience in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more empowering tales of justice today.